This video is about two issues: how Alaska became a state and our economic future. I'm a part of a generation that won statehood, and we achieved a great victory. But over the past 30 years, the federal government has stripped away the very rights we fought for and won. You know, we cannot put up with this. Alaskans must use every weapon at our disposal to make our case to the American people. We must force the federal government to live up to its word, and we will.
Statehood was the outstanding achievement of one generation. It established the rights of Alaskans to have a say in their own destiny and their children's future. But those rights have been under assault almost from the first day of statehood. Congress has broken a promise it made to Alaskans, a promise that guaranteed revenue from minerals on federal land. Alaska needed that money to fund the high cost of statehood.
Statehood is a very expensive matter. And that what happened was at the time of our territory, the citizens here were not paying for any of those things which are government services. They weren't paying for the transportation system or the education system or the corrections or the judiciary or any of those things. Very high cost.
Alaska was so underdeveloped that it was thought that the Statehood Act would have to have within it positive things to get a state going. There was no sense that if Alaska simply had statehood, it could run itself. There were a lot of worries that Alaska might go belly up financially.
Congress recognized Alaska's inability to pay for state government through taxes alone. In the Statehood Compact, Congress promised Alaska revenue from mineral development on federal land. Alaskans voted for statehood, believing that money would be there to help them carry the financial burden. But in the past 35 years, the federal government has withdrawn most of its land in Alaska, restricting oil and gas development on millions of acres. The withdrawals together equal the size of Texas.
In the last 20 years, they've withdrawn a lot of land. And I don't disagree that they have the right for that taking. But if they took that from the central United States, they'd have to pay for it. And when they take it from us, they have to pay for it. And so that's why I filed the suit. That's part of our economic base. First, I just want to announce, as you already know, that we filed a landmark lawsuit yesterday evening.
In 1993, the state filed a lawsuit against the federal government for violation of the Statehood Compact. The suit seeks $29 billion in lost revenue.
But unless the people themselves understand what the suits are about, they won't be won. Unless they realize that for every federal department presently, they are looking to Alaska to aggrandize themselves with more land, more power, more rules and regulations, so that the people of Alaska find themselves cut short.
To better understand the lawsuit, you must understand the history of statehood and why Congress made the promises it made. The statehood movement began 3 generations ago. In the 1930s, Alaska was a half-forgotten territory. Statehood seemed a remote dream, and the sourdoughs who stayed after the gold played out had little interest in politics.
People who lived here for a long time, they liked the freedom. It was, it was not, people didn't live high off the hog except those who were in control of resource extraction, and they lived very well indeed. But the Alaskans who made, those who made their home on a year-round basis, they eked out a living pretty much, but they liked it.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
But freedom was being threatened across the globe as Japan and Germany armed themselves for a new world war. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and occupied the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska, Washington took a new interest in Alaska.
Japan invades the Aleutian Islands. The rising sun flies on American soil.
Thousands of soldiers and construction workers flooded into the territory. When the war ended, many of the soldiers and workers stayed in Alaska. These new Alaskans had new ideas about government.
Whereas we were full-fledged citizens in the states where we came from, and we had fought a war for democracy, here in Alaska, we were disenfranchised. We didn't have a vote, we didn't have voting representation in the U.S. Senate, and Alaska was controlled by the federal government.
It took an appropriation of Congress to get a new typewriter for me in the governor's office.
Everything that we did had to be approved by Congress. In fact, most of the legislation that was established during the territorial days was that we did by memorial, not by bill. We memorialized Congress, and we forever prayed that they would do things for us. And the Statehood Compact and the statehood movement was to turn that around.
The man who turned these injustices into a movement for statehood was Ernest Gruening. He was a high-ranking official under President Franklin Roosevelt. When Gruening had a falling out with the Secretary of the Interior, he was made governor of Alaska.
What Roosevelt decided to do was to promote him up and out. And he sent him to Siberia, as it were. All of a sudden he finds himself in Juneau, for God's sakes. Now Juneau is not the Paris of the North even today, but he comes here in 1939, he was appalled. This is my home, but he decided to make something of Alaska.
When Gruening got to Alaska, he was shocked by what he saw. Alaska's bounty had become big business. Outside interests were exploiting the territory, taking its resources and leaving.
We let the outside interests rape the land and run away with the profits.
The canneries took so many salmon, they threatened the runs, and the territory was powerless to stop it. Gruening said the only way to change that was to become a state.
His dream was for Alaska to become a state. He was quite determined that it would become a state.
Time and again, we have petitioned the Congress of the United States, asking help to develop this great land of ours, to prevent its resources from being drained, to give ourselves a voice in the control of our own destiny. I tell you, there's only one way that Alaska can ever realize its future, and that is to become a state.
That's right.
Gruening's dream became a movement of the people, and the statehood campaign went to Congress. In Washington, Alaska had a powerful advocate in Bob Bartlett, the territory's voteless delegate to Congress.
As a delegate to Congress, he could introduce legislation, but he had no vote, so he had nothing to trade. Yet he had many bills passed. I think in one legislative session, Congressional session, he had more bills passed than anyone else. And that obviously was due to his personality, his ability to work with people.
But Bartlett's influence was not enough. Congress was opposed to statehood. Many were swayed by Winton Arnold, a lobbyist for the salmon industry and a relentless opponent of statehood.
Arnold, then he never said, I'm against statehood, but then he would proceed to lay out reasons why Alaska would never be able to afford statehood.
They had very, very big charts and very descriptive arguments of how costly it was going to be and that people were going to be taxed.
It doomed the statehood movement for years. How could a tiny population with one industry pay for the roads and schools and other services funded by state government? The tax base was too small.
Can we afford it? And it was a pretty handy issue for opponents to rely on. And it was the one, as I said earlier, that was the most difficult to handle and which had the greatest continuing validity in my judgment.
I did question our ability to finance statehood. One, we didn't have oil, wasn't even on the horizon back then, and our capabilities of financing appeared very grim indeed.
A key point in the state's lawsuit is that Congress repeatedly turned down statehood based on the financial issue.
There have been 16 attempts to make us a state since 1916 on. In almost every single case, there was one prevailing reason that ran as a thread throughout all of these, the opposition to our statehood, and that was that the congressmen who opposed statehood looked at Alaska and said there was no way we could afford the cost of government.
Alaska would need a lot of land and control of its resources to survive. In 1950, the House passed a statehood bill granting about 20 million acres, but some Alaskans said it wasn't good enough.
It gave us 23 million acres of land, didn't give us any of the resource, none of the 90-10, none of the things we needed, and I said it won't work.
Walter Hickel, a carpenter and builder from Anchorage, went to Washington to demand more land.
I got into Taft's office, and I started talking, and I remember pulling my chair up in front of his desk, and I'm really going at it. And Senator Welker from Idaho, I had raised some ruckus before that about nobody's listening to us, and so they sent Senator Welker up the year before that, and just a young senator, so he was sitting there with me, and he said, young man, how much land do you think you need? And I blurted out 100 million acres. And as I was walking out of there, I was sick to my stomach. I said, I wonder how much land we have. And it was the truth. It was true. And so they called down to Interior, and they called down. Pretty soon they came back and said, you have 365 million acres. And I said, we should ask for half of it.
Soon after, a House committee proposed a 100 million acre land grant. The measure was defeated, but it set a precedent, one that opened the door to giving more land, more resources to Alaska to fund its government. As the statehood movement unfolded, Alaskans began flying to Washington at their own expense to lobby for statehood.
Even though we were non-voting little peons of some peculiar political status in the national culture, when we went back to Washington and talked to Congress, they'd listen. And when they'd ask us, who paid your way here? And we could say, we paid it. They want to know, why did you do it? Well, and then you tell them, why? We got to have this in Alaska. They're there for a reason.
But the opposition in Congress was formidable. In 1955, Alaskans tried a new strategy.
One of the prime objections to Alaska was that the rest of the country thought its citizens were these social misfits who were not capable of governing themselves. And so the statehood promoters said, well, how do we show that we're capable of governing ourselves? Well, one of the ways we could do this is hold a constitutional convention that would be a model of procedure, and that would produce a model constitution.
55 delegates were elected from all over Alaska, some with no legislative experience. The delegates chose as their leader Bill Egan, a soft-spoken grocer from Valdez with a deep love for Alaska.
He had been a figure in the state legislature, but by chairing the Constitutional Convention, he amazed people with the political insight and the sense of order and devotion that he could bring out in people. He got people to believe in themselves.
The delegates had just 75 days to write a constitution. As the deadline neared, they crafted the words all Alaskans would live by.
There was a lot of work being done during the last days, and at the same time, it was also an emotional a volcano, you might say, coming out and sort of ready to blast forth.
I felt like I had been, part of something very special. And I sensed that it was the bringing together of Alaska. And when I had to call the roll the last time, I could hardly get through it. I was choked up. And I looked up, and there wasn't a dry eye in the place.
The Constitution was hailed by national groups as one of the best, perhaps the best, Constitution in the country.
They viewed it then, as I think many do now, as probably the best Constitution of any state. And that fact was a very persuasive indication that indeed we were capable of governing ourselves.
Voters went to the polls and overwhelmingly approved the Constitution. They also elected to send 2 senators and a representative to Washington to lobby for statehood. The delegation would be voteless, but the message would be clear. Alaska is serious about statehood.
And every day, why these 3 gentlemen were on the floor or visiting each of the congressmen and each of the senators, and it was that kind of pressure that brought about the debate that we needed to have control of our resource base. And the big debate was, well, they can't take care of themselves.
In 1958, their work paid off. An extraordinary statehood bill came before Congress, a bill that would give Alaska a way to pay for statehood. It would transfer more than 100 million acres of land and minerals to the new government, the largest land grant ever given to a state. It also pledged 90% of all revenue from oil, gas, and coal on most federal land.
What they did is they said, not only will you own the resources on your own land, but you are going to own 90%, you're going to have a 90% beneficial interest in the natural resources on our land, on the federal land.
It would be the last statehood bill for Alaska.
It was a very emotional time because everyone realized if it was not voted through, the legislation would die, because that was the end of the second session. It'd have to start all over again.
Well, it was some kind of a shock to me. I sat up in the press gallery of the Senate when they took the roll. And I was surrounded by all these newspaper guys I knew. And before the roll was completed, they were quizzing me, what are you going to do now in Alaska with all this? Now it's going to be a state, what are you going to do? And I had this emotional response, which was quite, I can't talk about it. My throat tightens up when I do talk about it. But it was, it put the monkey on our backs here now to perform. We have to do all these things we told them we were going to do.
I was in Washington in the galley when the vote was counted, and some of those people like Senator Cotton looked up there and went like this and waved at us.
The Senate turned around after the bill was passed and applauded the gallery. They applauded the people.
The bill would become law only if Alaskans approved it. And once they approved it, it would be unalterable unless both parties agreed to the change.
Senator Butler, before he died, he was testifying. He wanted me to stand behind his chair, and I did. And some of the things they talked about was that this is unusual legislation, and the colleagues better understand that it cannot be changed just by a vote of Congress. It'll have to have the approval of the people of Alaska.
Secretary of the Interior Fred Seaton traveled the state talking to Alaskans, making sure they understood the terms of the contract. Seaton told Alaskans The Act reaffirms Alaska's preferential treatment in receiving 90% of all revenues from oil, gas, and coal leasing on federal land. The additional costs of statehood will be more than offset by additional revenues made available to Alaska.
And he talked about things like the 90-10 and the fact we would have the money to pay for government. That was very important to them, to pay for government. Now, what did we do? In fact, the entire Statehood Compact was published in most of the major newspapers so that the people would have a chance to read it. We're getting the picture here that this is a contract, and then we voted to accept it.
The vote was overwhelming, and that meant that that issue that passed Congress was no longer just an act of Congress. It became a contract between the peoples of Alaska and the United States government. And it went into effect on January the 3rd, 1959.
Alaskans accepted the financial burden of statehood because they believed the contract gave them the means to pay for it. With the Statehood Act, Congress promised Alaska 90% of oil and gas revenue from federal lands. But the federal government has since locked up millions of acres of its land, in effect saying Alaska gets 90% of nothing. ANWR is a case in point. Experts believe a major oil field lies beneath its coastal plain. But the federal government has blocked oil and gas development in ANWR. It's estimated $29 billion of oil off limits to Alaska. The lawsuit filed by the Hickel administration asked that the state be compensated for $29 billion in lost revenue.
What's it worth? $1,000 an acre? $100 an acre? What's Prudhoe Bay worth? Now there's 200,000 acres of Prudhoe Bay. If they'd have taken that, what's it worth?
But the issue goes beyond money. The suit seeks to preserve the achievements of one generation of Alaskans. With the statehood contract, that generation established the rights of Alaskans to have a say in their economic future. If the federal government can arbitrarily change the terms of a contract, no state's rights are secure. The state filed suit to make the federal government live up to its promises and to defend what one generation fought 15 years to win. For the legal challenge to succeed, this generation of Alaskans must understand what's at stake.
I don't know how you can explain it unless it's to make the individual realize that his ability to make a living is being jeopardized. If you want to become one of those exhibits for tourists that they point their little cameras at and take a picture of the inhabitants, unless you're looking forward to that kind of future, then that is all that is left to you.
The lawsuits are real. They're there for the students of the future and the past to study, to see what was granted to us in that compact and why we have to defend it.